Those who can do those things well, no matter what industry they're in, they will rise within their organizations quite dramatically and quite quickly because they'll be able to present well, they'll be able to communicate well, and whatever ideas they have, assuming they have any good ideas, will be seen and heard in a more effective and comprehensive manner.
We're in search of new rules for work, evidence-based practices fit for a hybrid world. This year, we're hosting a multi-month interdisciplinary research project looking for the best ways of unleashing team creativity. Join me, David Mastronardi, and my New Rules for Work co-producer, Elise Keith, as we explore the minds and the work of the people shaping not just our project, but the new rules for work. This project is made possible through the generous contributions of many people who are volunteering their time and through the support of our partners. To learn more about the project, buy tickets for January Symposium, register your team for the experiment, or partner with us, check out newrulesforwork.com. If you want to get in touch directly, email info@newrulesforwork.com.
Hi, everybody. Our guest today is Dr. Joseph Allen. He's a professor of industrial and organizational psychology at the University of Utah, where he also directs the Center for Meeting Effectiveness. Now, Joe has more than 200 publications in academic outlets. He's worked with over 400 organizations as a consultant. And in the last, 3 years, he's written 4 books on how to run effective meetings for the general business audience, including Suddenly Virtual, Making Remote Meetings Work, Suddenly Hybrid, Managing the Modern Meeting, and Running Effective Meetings for Dummies, which we are not. And we are, and in addition to all of these books and running the center and whatnot, Joe and I met several years ago while I was looking at how do I make sense of meeting science as a meeting practitioner. And we've collaborated several times over the years, including on a course on the simple rules for meaningful meetings. And I'm super thrilled that Joe has agreed to collaborate with us once more as we find these new rules for work in this multi-site, large, quasi-experimental, fabulous research project. Thank you so much for joining us, Joe.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Joe, where in the world are you right now?
My home office in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Okay. You're the first meeting scientist that I've had the pleasure to meet. What is meeting science, and what does a meeting scientist do?
So I consider myself a self-proclaimed meeting scientist because my training is actually in industrial and organizational psychology and organizational science, which is much broader than meetings. But interestingly enough, meetings are everywhere that organizational scientists might be. And so as a meeting scientist, what that essentially means is that I apply basic scientific principles, how we study, the things that we study as a scientist, to workplace meetings and meetings of all types and shapes and sizes and so forth. So there are a few other people around the world who would consider themselves meeting scientists, and those people study meetings at wherever they're found, and apply the things that we know from best practice, right, to try to understand, are the things that we claim to be best practice actually best practice? And can we show that with data and with the experiences that people are actually having in meetings, and get that both objectively and subjectively? So it's really kind of taking a very critical look at this thing that we do all the time and providing a way to understand that and science-based recommendations for everybody, really, on how to make our work experiences and our collaborative experiences and our meetings better.
So we've had a huge shift in the last 2.5 years.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what it looked like from a meeting scientist's point of view. How have you been observing and noticing what's been going on?
So, the pandemic was terribly fascinating, right? Terrible for all the reasons that we all know. The sickness, the death, the stress, the unwell being that it caused, the locking ourselves in our houses and things. There's plenty to be not very happy about. So it was terrible in many ways. It was extremely fascinating as a meeting scientist because for the first however many thousands of years humans have been on the planet, the modality for meetings was a constant, right? Meaning 80 to 90% of our meetings were face to face. And yes, technology had started in the 1900s and in the early 2000s had started to introduce technologies that would allow us to meet in different ways. We still met face to face 80 to 90% of the time across all of our different industries and so forth. The exceptions are those distributed industries, right? When you're communicating across time, space and time, right? In terms of geographic location and so forth. That's when we started using the technologies. But even then, the technology we were using were planes because we would fly to these places much more frequently than we are even doing now, even though the planes are all busy now. But we're traveling less for business because we know we can communicate this way. So for me, it was extremely fascinating because this was the first major disruption in that modality constant that we'd experienced in the history of humanity. We went from being 100%, or nearly 100% face to face to being, remote, right? So we went, 80% face to face to about 20% face to face, and 5%, remote to being 60 to 70% remote, right, in virtual meetings. And that shift was, a dramatic change in how we meet.
And so behaviorally, outside of the mode, what impact or behaviors did you see changing, maybe at an individual level or even at a meeting level, all the way up through organizationally? What did this do to how work was getting done, how people were meeting?
Yeah, so it changed a lot of things very quickly, right? That's why the first book in this series of books that I read that I wrote over the last few years was called Suddenly Virtual. It was truly sudden, right? And so the sudden nature of it meant that we had to figure out what worked immediately, right? And so, some of the things that happened were people had to meet from wherever they were, right? And so the behaviors we had, so there was initially, okay, I'm meeting from my couch, I'm meeting from my dining room table, I'm meeting from, you know, uh, the bench that I've got sitting outside because I wanted to be outside for a little while. We had to meet in all these different places. And over time, we started to realize, oh, we need to kind of curate our background a little bit. We need to kind of make sure that we look professional sometimes when we're meeting. And then we realized, oh, my little dot on my camera on my laptop is a really kind of a crappy camera. So then we're like buying cameras and office chairs and other things to kind of equip ourselves, in that way. And then behaviorally, things changed as well. In face-to-face meetings, we didn't have to worry about the mute button. We certainly still do now, right? And so I think the reality is that there's things that were introduced by the virtual environment that changed the way we behave in our virtual and in our hybrid meetings, and to some degree in our face-to-face meetings. It's kind of funny. I go to a face-to-face meeting and I see people behaving a little bit like they're in a virtual meeting because they've been in virtual meetings so much, right? And so they're like
What's an
calling people
example of
by
that?
name, right? Um, instead of just looking at them. They'll look at them, but then they'll say their name. It's like, you don't need to say their name. You're in person. You can just look at them and nod or lean in and they're going to start talking, right? So even the way that we naturally behave kind of took a bit of a change there. Now we quickly get back into our old routines, that sort of thing. But it changed a lot of things in terms of behavior initially, and there's going to be some lingering effects for sure.
What has been, maybe scientifically, if we can frame it up that way, what's been surprising from a scientific standpoint?
Um, that's a tough question to some degree because a lot of the things that we thought would happen. So let me tell you a quick story. So my co-author on all three of all the books that I've written recently is a wonderful former journalist named Karen Reed. And her and I were doing a podcast webinar thing about the beginning of March, like March 5th or 6th, something like that. And we talked about virtual meetings and remote work and that sort of thing, and talked about the things that would change, right? We talked about how the camera would be the window into people's lives, into their homes, into their experiences. We would need to curate that environment. We talked about how that would create equal communication environment, and yet some of the problems that we have in face-to-face meetings, like the unequal sharing, would creep in, and we'd have to figure out ways to manage that and so forth. So we talked about all those things. 5 days later, every one of those things happened. Right? We were saying 5 years, 10 years out. We were pushing, saying that over time we'll eventually develop, some of these things, but they all happen within a few days. And so, first off, I'm not a very good fortune teller, so don't ask me to read any tarot cards or anything of that nature, because I'm terrible at it, clearly. But more importantly, a lot of the things that happened didn't really surprise me. I was a little, but the biggest thing that I was concerned about was whether everything I'd done to that point mattered anymore, right? I was very scared that I had done years, and others had done many more years than me, studying groups and teams and meetings and so forth. And now we changed the modality and the environment dramatically. And so one of the first things I did was collected data on all the different things that were relevant to face-to-face meetings that would still be relevant in a virtual meeting or in a hybrid meeting, just to see if they still mattered and if everything I'd done before would still be useful. And I was pleasantly not surprised, but confirmed that most of those things mattered. Now, number of seats around a conference table didn't matter as much when you were doing in the virtual environment, but things like starting and ending on time and having a purpose, and making sure people have opportunities to participate, and dealing with bad behaviors and shutting down the monologuers, all those things that we'd studied quite a bit in the meeting science, that were process, that were how we talk to each other, how we engage with each other, all continued to matter, which was both comforting for me, because it meant that my science wasn't completely obsolete now, but also it meant that, oh my goodness, we really need to share this and share it quick, which is why we wrote Suddenly Virtual in 6 weeks. The point was we had to get that thing written and to the publisher as fast as possible, so that way people hopefully would get it and use it and understand it's okay, we can still do meetings well. Here are some ways to make sure that can happen for you.
So I'm really curious. The things that still matter, kind of modality agnostic. I got a couple of them. Start, end time, participation, diminishing the loud talkers, if you will.
Yeah, the bad behaviors. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What were some of those others?
Monologuers.
I like that one. Okay.
Which professors like myself are good at. Ask Joe a question, he'll talk for 10 minutes,
I understand having some experience
with
myself.
Me. Thanks.
In monologuing. That's why I was putting you on mute before. So what are some of the different responses maybe that you've seen as people were learning, and for the same reason that you wanted to get the book out so quickly? What were some interesting responses that you were seeing, people in these new modalities? Any interesting stories, or maybe just pure observations from a scientific standpoint?
Yeah. So one of the things that we noticed was that there was more equal sharing among people initially in virtual meetings. Initially. That's important. And I say initially because what happened was it was novel. This was a new environment for a lot of people. And we were kind of sense making together. And because of that, we went a little colorblind, and we went a little gender blind, and we went a little more equality and egalitarian. And we actually have data that shows that those virtual meetings in the first couple of months that we were able to capture had more equality in terms of talk time among members of small groups, right? 5 to 10 people, right? And I said initially because, unfortunately, those biases that have been around forever, unfortunately, and have been common in workplace meetings and other meetings for forever, started to creep into our virtual meetings. So now, I mean, today our virtual meetings are very similar in terms of talk time, in terms of equality and equity issues as our face-to-face meetings were in 2019, 2018. And so that's data that we've analyzed, that we're working on publishing, that just hasn't come out yet. So they're, hot off the presses, or not even quite to the presses yet. It's just data we have. But it's one of those things where I initially was like, oh wow, this is so great, and I was like, oh wow, this is so terrible, because this spike of goodness, and equality and meeting equity, and then a drop as we got comfortable, as the novelty and newness wore off, and we got more used to that environment. We assumed our stereotypical roles again, in many cases not for the betterment of ourselves or the organizations that we might work for or that we are representing. So
we adapt extremely well.
Yeah, adapted extremely well in a not so good way.
Right.
Reverted.
We reverted.
Right? Like we revert to old habits. I think that came up in another conversation that we've had.
Yep. We return to what is comfortable.
So I'm curious, Joe, as you've watched people make these changes, you and I were talking earlier about how scientists have an opportunity to find the flaws in things and whatnot. Where have you found the lights? What has shown beyond the novelty as an interruption to bad meeting habits? What else have you seen come up that has shown some glimmers of hope?
That actually came out. The thing that comes to mind that came out of this actually was written in the second book that I wrote with Karen, which is Suddenly Hybrid, right? Hybrid meetings, and I say this in the book, we say this in the book, and I still believe it to be true, are the most inclusive form of meeting. And what I mean by that is people can meet from anywhere with just about any type of connection when you're talking about a hybrid meeting, right? If they're in the office, they can come together around the conference table. If they're not in the office, they can connect through Zoom or Teams or any number of other virtual meeting platforms, right? If they're not in any places where they've got a camera, they can connect through their telephone, right? Through their telephone device or whatnot. And so because we have those choices, it makes it possible for people to be included in conversations that maybe they would never have been able to be included in, right? Due to commute times or health issues or any number of other things. Because frankly, we can now stay home and not be 100% in terms of our wellness, but we can pop on a call for a little while if we would like to. And if it's, if we're not too under the weather, right? And those are conversations that we didn't really think to have in the past, right? If we took a sick day, it was a sick day and that was it. And maybe that's good. We should continue to take a sick day, but the reality is it makes it possible for different, people to connect in a lot of different ways. And what was so promising about that is the early adopters of hybrid were getting it right. So the data that we collected for that book showed us that early adopters of hybrid were having having just as satisfying and just as effective meetings as they were having in virtual and in face-to-face environments, right? But here's the kicker. There were fewer bad behaviors in hybrid meetings. There was less recovery required in hybrid meetings. There was less faking of emotions in hybrid meetings than in virtual and face-to-face meetings. And we thought, oh, what's going on here? What are they doing? What's the problem here? Because we thought for sure that hybrid would be, yes, the most inclusive form, but also the hardest to do and truly a terrible experience for everyone because it's so hard to do. Well, what they were doing is all those things that are modality agnostic. They were embracing having a purpose, starting and ending on time, making sure everyone could participate, right? And the most important thing for making a hybrid meeting successful is being seen and heard. Most importantly, heard, right? Because you may have someone on the phone. And if you remember everybody and you make sure everyone's seen and heard, you're going to have a pretty good meeting.
So is this one of those initially?
Yes and no. And that's why I said early adopters, right? So the early adopters, the reason they were having so much success in their hybrid meetings is because they were doing some of the things that meeting scientists and meeting practitioners have been preaching for many years, right? Whereas the typical person in the typical organization doesn't really do those things at the frequency that these early adopters do these things. We're doing these things. And so as more people are embracing hybrid, they're probably falling back into those same old habits of just getting people together to talk about stuff and not really defining the stuff until they get into the room, and then running late from this or showing up late from that, or running over. You know, they're still engaging in some of those things that we really need to not do, right? And so I would say that the regular adopters are probably still struggling with hybrid, right? To a reasonable extent.
So it
but-
seems like
yeah.
the early adopters, and maybe this is a stretch to say of anything, but it seems like the early adopters are maybe less elastic, if you will, in terms of like they were doing meetings right, like the whole time, and then they adapted to this new modality, and then they kind of stayed. Whereas for other people, we'll just call them the the second wave, the next wave of adopters, there was a freshness to it, a novelty to it, where they also kind of got it right for a little bit, but then it wore off.
Yeah.
And then they were the ones who were more likely to revert in the organization.
Yeah, I mean, revert or just carry on with the way they've been behaving in their virtual and in their face-to-face meetings, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the early adopters, for whatever reason, whether it be because they recognized that there were platform agnostic attributes of good meetings,
Mm-hmm.
you know, maybe they carried things over that they knew worked, right? They applied this hammer worked on that nail. I'm going to use it on this other nail, right? Maybe they thought that, right? And so they tried it and it worked, right? But for a lot of us, you know, who, myself included, unfortunately, who have not always embraced the best practices, probably didn't embrace them in our virtual meetings, and probably still aren't doing them in our hybrid meetings. The problem is they become a much larger glaring issue in a hybrid meeting than they would do in a face-to-face or in a virtual meeting, right? And so because of that, it's, your hybrid meetings are probably still going to be the most challenging form of meeting, even though they also are the most inclusive form.
So I think we're still in this moment, and there's something to the fact that everything changed, and I don't know if there is a name to that phenomena when you just feel open. It feels like it's that same sense after you get back from a great trip or a great vacation. Something happened where we were all in it for that little while, and we were getting things right initially. Some of us have gone back or we're just not practicing these best practices.
Yeah.
But we feel like we're still in this moment of change because we still haven't figured out what is next. That's why we call this the new rules, right? We're still figuring out these new rules.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, with an eye towards the future, why advise us? Why get involved with this project that we're undertaking? What was exciting about it for you?
Well, the genie's out of the bottle when it comes to how we meet, how we collaborate, and how we work, right? We made it. The COVID-19 made it necessary for us to figure out different ways of operating to continue to work, continue to get our paychecks, so we could continue to live, right? It forced us to innovate. It forced us to be creative in how we collaborated, right? And it also gave us the opportunity to see whether or not we could work from home and still be effective. And the answer is yes, for the most part. Not entirely. There are some things that are not quite right with that. For example, the narrowing of our networks within and between organizations. So there are things to keep that in mind. But because the genie's out of the bottle, because we've done this now, there are new ways of working that we have to be willing to consider. And because of that, we have to kind of think about what are the right best practices to ensure success into the future, a future that includes virtual and hybrid meetings and face-to-face meetings for that matter, right? The old ways of working are still the same ways people have been working in the past for a lot of industries that didn't get to shut down during COVID because we still needed peanut butter, right? And other manufacturing things. And we still needed to be able to go to the doctor, even if we had to mask up or triple mask up, whatever we had to do. Some occupations, some industries did not ever embrace, virtual and hybrid in the ways that office workers or IT professionals or other industries did. And so because of that, we need both the old rules of working, and those old rules of working have to intersect effectively with the new rules of working, so that way organizations can embrace each other as they did pre-pandemic to be successful into the future. So it's a no-brainer to be involved with an experiment that we've been kicking around, this whole effort to identify how do we collaborate and how do we be effective in the future in these new rules of work.
What's an exciting unknown here? As what are we going to do that you as a meeting scientist haven't done? Like what's kind of greenfield here for what we're about to embark on? That's new for you.
So I think there's some recent work that people have done. I think it was probably pre-pandemic, but these mega studies. These are these kinds of studies where you get a lot of people involved from a lot of different places, from a lot of different perspectives, doing a lot of different but related things, so that way you can make comparisons. And so it's this perfect combination of science and practice, where you have the scientists giving, stern advice, please do it this way so that way we can still make comparisons. And you have the practice saying, hey, please do it this way so we can actually use it, right? And if you can find that sweet spot together, then you get both, right? And so that's why this is something that I couldn't do on my own, because I'm still an egghead scientist. Even though I like to talk to practitioners and I work with a lot of organizations and I provide my thoughts and insights, I'm still at the root of my training and development an academic. And so for me to really bridge the gap into practice in a meaningful way, I got to talk to practitioners. I got to talk to meeting scientists who are practicing. I got to talk to collaborators in organizations that are actually living the work, then as opposed to bringing it into my lab and testing it in that way. And so this is one of those ways, one of those kinds of efforts that has the potential. Now, will it succeed? I don't know. We're just getting going here, right? But I'm really excited about it, and I'm really hopeful. And there's been enough of these mega studies by other people in other areas and other potential other areas of focus that have done some really fascinating and really meaningful things. And so I'm hopeful that this can do likewise.
And so just to be clear, because Elise and I were talking about this, I don't know, some weeks ago, and she brought it to my attention. Mega studies is a technical term. It isn't
kind of. I think it's a, we in the egghead scientist world would call it a multi-site quasi field experimental design, where you have people in different locations doing similar processes within and outside, within labs and outside and within organizations, for a comparison that could be made across these different locations and dimensions, right? And so rather than use all those words, it makes more sense to say mega study, because that's what it is.
It's much more interesting.
Yeah. And when you get down to those technical things, they get kind of dry and boring for some folks, and very, very fascinating and interesting for others. And so we'll definitely use all these different words to describe what we're doing, so that way people, no matter what their background, can join us.
I think I saw it referenced most recently by a group of behavioral scientists, and they talked about it as an approach to getting to applied behavioral science. So, yeah. So there too, looking at, we have this interesting tension, and Joe, I'm sure you've heard some of this in our conversations between, the practitioners who are talking about how do we host a session, a meeting where we are adapting to what's happening, and we're dealing with complexity and emergence and allowing for, all of the nuance and sensing the room. And then you've got the science that's like, it's got to be scripted and it's got to last exactly this long. And we've got to have, all of that kind of stuff. So, so when you think about it as an applied research project. Can you help practitioners make some sense of why it needs to be balanced in that way?
Yeah, so I have been an applied researcher, which is what we call a researcher who's not necessarily in the lab, one who interact who wants to collect data and work with people outside of the lab domain, right? There's nothing wrong with that, right? And that's the thing about researchers. There's quite a variety there. However, there's still tension between an applied researcher and a practitioner, because there are certain things that we have to be able to do and have to have in order for our applied research to be publishable, to be, go through the peer review process from an academic standpoint, and still, deliver some outcomes for us that we have to have for our jobs, practically speaking, right? But also that our peers can read, evaluate, and use as they think about their next projects, whether they be peers that are in the lab who say, oh, that's kind of a fascinating quasi-experimental, let's see if it holds in the lab, or those who are applied who say, oh, that's neat, let's extend it by doing X, Y, Z, right? And so we need certain things to be met, right, in order for that to happen. Practitioners also need certain things to be met, right, for the outcomes to be meaningful for them. And that's not necessarily, in fact, it would be inappropriate to say that it's less rigorous to do a practice-oriented, test of the various things that we're trying to do. It just means that there are certain things that they're looking for that may not be as important or relevant to the applied researcher. And so whenever I've done a project in this kind of environment, I've worked with the fire service, I've worked with nonprofit organizations, I've worked with large enterprise organizations. Whenever I work with people who are both scientists and practitioners in that kind of group, there's this tension. And we have to collaborate, we have to talk through that tension and see, okay, how can we do the give and take to ensure that both are able to accomplish what they want to accomplish. Neither one's probably fully satisfied, but we meet in that middle spot where it's a nice sweet spot where we know we're going to have a little bit of a challenge on the publishing side. And we know we're going to have a little bit of a challenge from the CEO who says, well, why did you do it that way? But we're going to have enough to make sure that what we have is truly that nice spot of science and practice coming together to solve the big problems that we're running into as people and organizations around the world.
So if you've got that tension where nobody's quite happy, is that how you know when you have a good mega study? Everybody's a little chippy about it.
Everybody's a little bit, uncomfortable.
Well, if it were up to me, I would have done it this way, right?
I mean, and when I say uncomfortable, I don't mean like, inappropriate uncomfortable. I mean, there's just this little bit of, gosh, this is right. A little bit pushing outside of where I'm happy, where I'm comfortable, but it's still so cool. I can't help but be involved, right?
Well, and I think that's good.
That's the space that we got to kind of live in, right? Or we're not going to be able to we're not going to be able to put up a tent that's big enough to fit, everybody in it.
Well, that's the first way that I've heard it put, that as you did. It's like, yeah, I'm willing to make this compromise because overall, this is such a cool thing that we're doing. And I feel like we're in that space.
Yeah. And there'll continue to be that tension throughout the whole process. Right. Yeah. And we can get into some of the specific challenges we've already faced if that's helpful. But the point being is we're going to continue to grapple with that at each stage of the process. How the symposium was done, how the experiments, are launched, what the processes look like, and how we compare them, how we don't compare them, and which groups can we be assured are doing the experiments accurately, and those that maybe are not. And so we're going to have plenty to talk about and plenty of tension between the practice and the egghead scientists such as myself. But that's usually, I know we're doing it the right way when there is some of that tension. But I consider it positive tension. If you have the right people together, it's tension that you have in the meeting, and then you go to the pub afterwards and you have a great time, just hanging out and enjoying being together. If you can be in the same environment, or you're on a Zoom call sharing your favorite beverage from a distance. But regardless, those are the kinds of collaborations that are most meaningful for me, and I found them to be most meaningful for just about anyone that I've talked to that I've been able to interact with. So it's a harder type of approach to doing research, but it also is a type of research that has the most potential to make change in our world. And so it's fun and challenging at the same time.
I think it's just like any good meeting where all the voices are heard and people feel comfortable being themselves and bringing their point of view, but also being at least understanding of others in continuing to move forward. I mean, it just sounds like a good collaboration. The best collaborations I've been a part of haven't been the ones that any one person kind of steamroll. Oh, we all just did what that person said or wanted to do. It's when you move forward with a little bit of healthy friction there. So let's keep on that. Let's a year from today, we're back. We're doing another recording, and everything's gone super well. And maybe we're having that drink in person. Maybe it's just on Zoom. And it's, in your eyes, it's the best possible outcome that could have happened. What are we talking about over that beverage? What's happened for you?
From an academic perspective, we would have one or two papers already drafted and headed out the door, or close to it. We would have submitted several things to various conferences that are of interest to the academics and others. From a practice perspective, we'll have put out some white papers and some guidelines that are already being implemented in some organizations. And we'll have done podcasts and webinars and other things talking about those and sharing them broadly. And I think if we've gotten to that point, we may have not solved all the problems in the world, but we'll have at least moved this down the street a bit, right? And I think that would be an amazing set of outcomes. I think that would be meaningful from my perspective. There may be others that I'm not thinking of at the moment, but that would be pretty exciting.
I have a question on that one. So we're out there a year from now, and it's been amazing. Who all has been involved to help us get there? How many teams have run this experiment? How many other academics from other branches are looking at this corpus of data? What does the community around this thing look like?
As many as we can convince to do it, because the reality is, for the most part, larger numbers are going to make it easier for the scientists to test their hypotheses. And larger numbers are also going to mean that we're going to have greater possibility of generalizability. So that way the practitioners can say, yep, this works, we're going to do it, right? And so from my perspective, it's as inclusive and as broad and involvement as we can possibly get, right? Now, if you wanted me to, I could click around on my computer here and figure out a power analysis and tell you exactly how many people we need to have do this so I can test this hypothesis that I've been thinking about for years and I needed a mega study to be able to do it. I could go there. But the reality is, I just want to make sure that we include as many people as we can that are willing and interested to be involved. And I'd like that to be enough that we can do the things I just described, which is not zero. It's 50, 100, 1,000 groups. I mean, and teams involved with this. I mean, that's what we're talking about to make some of those outcomes a reality.
So what about on the research side? So we have our advisor team.
Yes.
How do you see other academics potentially benefiting and participating?
Well, I mean, the outcomes I just mentioned, about conferences and publications, many academics, not all, but many academics are in a publish or perish environment. And so most academics who will choose to be involved with this are probably going to be wondering, hey, can I get on that publication or those publications, right? And if we get enough data, the answer is yeah, absolutely, right? Because the whole point would be to have enough data so that way we can test lots and lots and lots of different hypotheses and lots of different questions. And not only could they, be involved with the data collection, but if they saw something that they were pretty excited about, we'd identify another 50 teams that did similar processes or did the same process that they're interested in and say, here's the data. Go test your hypotheses. write up your things, and let's just and include and make sure you include everybody as that are involved with this as co-authors, and we'll all review it and all have a good time putting that out there. So again, I don't get as hung up as some people in the academic world do when it comes to authorship. I'm more of an inclusive type of authorship person. Some are not that way, and so I think we have to kind of keep that in mind and make sure that we find the right balance there. But from my perspective, I think an academic's going to look at, okay, if I'm going to put time to either propose a process or to do an experiment or be involved in some way, they're going to want to see the kinds of outcomes that their organization where they work is going to be proud of, as well as themselves be proud of, right? And so I think it's definitely doable, but I think that's something that we kind of have to keep in mind as we move forward.
How many hypotheses do you have for this experiment, Joe?
How many do I have?
Yeah, you.
Several. I mean, it's one of those things where I've been thinking about it a lot, and most of my hypotheses are around the idea, okay, if I'd use process X, is it better than process Y, right? Or does process X cause more of the good behaviors that I'm curious about than process Y does, right? Or so I could go on, but the point being is there's a lot of potential hypotheses that I have, and not least of which is if I have people from 30 different countries, and I have enough groups from 30 different countries who participate in this, now I got the whole layer of cultural differences to play around with, right? And there's also gender differences, and there's also company size differences, right? And company cultures. And so the number of, I just think about it, and if I just sat down for half an hour, I'd probably come up with 30 hypotheses that I would want to test. I've been trying not to do that quite yet because I'm not the only academic or person interested in looking at this. So, yeah.
So I have a question on that because I had one and I wondered if this is something we can look at, right? Because I was looking at some other meeting science studies and they had whole sets of teams that they disqualified because they didn't follow the process correctly. And I thought, wouldn't it be fascinating to look at the differences between teams who followed the process correctly and teams that didn't, and the differences in their rating of meeting satisfaction? Is the application of having to follow a process to the letter in and of itself a significant impact on the
and the kind of the fun thing about that is I think one of the requirements for these is to record the videos, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And if you record the video, then we can look at behaviors too. We can actually know, where did you deviate from the process, and how did that deviation immediately or over time affect the rest of the meeting, right?
Right.
So one thing, one of the studies that I've done, and Elise always gives me a hard time about it because when I show up late to a meeting, she reminds me of this. But one of the studies I've done is on lateness, right? And we showed that when people show up late, it affects the entire meeting throughout the whole rest of the time when compared to those who start on time. And that's just one little deviation from what we would consider a standard normal meeting process. Be there on time, period. Or, we're not on time, we're going to delay start, so on, right? So you can think about in all these different potential processes that will be proposed to run an effective hybrid meeting, and we're going to try them, and we're going to expect them to follow the process. And it'll be, that's a great question, Lisa. Does following this process make it better? Does deviating from this process make it worse? Or does deviating from this process make it better? Wouldn't that be fascinating then? Oh, the process was good, but these people over here deviated in, these 5 teams over here deviated in the same way, and it was even better. So who knows?
Joe, what's the most important job skill over the next 5 years?
Most important job skill? Communication flexibility.
Does that have some kind of implication of tech as well? I mean, I guess
Yeah.
I must. Right?
Yeah. So what I believe, and again, I told you not to ask me to predict the future because I'm terrible at it. I said that earlier. You better make sure that makes the cut because tarot cards are not my friend. Point being, communication flexibility is really about, can a person communicate in all the different methodologies and modalities in an effective manner, right? So this is asynchronous communication, this is synchronous communication, and it's all the different technologies, right? Those who can be effective in face-to-face, virtual, and hybrid meetings, who can be effective in email, text, audio, and video communication, strategies. Those who can do those things well, no matter what industry they're in, they will rise within their organizations quite dramatically and quite quickly because they'll be able to present well, they'll be able to communicate well, and whatever ideas they have, assuming they have any good ideas, will be seen and heard in a more effective and comprehensive manner. And so the people that communicate well in this very varied communication environment are going to be more effective. And those who aren't able to do that won't be as visible, and may teeter on the area of invisibility within their own organization.
That's great. If people want to find out more about you, more about your work, where your books are, where can we direct them?
So you're welcome to go to my website, joeallen.org. You can put that in the notes. That's where I've got links to my books. I've got links to the courses like the one that Elise and I have put together, which we are still very proud of, and links to my research. So, and also a contact me button, so you can always reach out to me that way. I'm always happy to communicate with people who've seen my podcast, seen my videos, seen my academic work. Love to engage and communicate with anybody who reaches out.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for this. Thank you for also participating and guiding us on the project. It's better because of it.
Glad to do it. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Thanks for listening. To learn about the new rules for work, purchase tickets, or submit your team for an experiment, check out newrulesforwork.com. If you're interested in partnering, reach out to us at info@newrulesforwork.com.